Sarah Martinez had always been invisible on the military base. At 24, she was just another face among the hundreds of soldiers stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. Her medical bag was her constant companion, and her quiet demeanor made her blend into the background of the bustling military operation. Nobody paid much attention to the small-framed woman from Texas who had joined the Army to pay for medical school. She wasn't the type who stood out in formation or commanded attention in the mess hall. While other soldiers talked about their combat experiences and showed off their weapons, Sarah kept her head down and focused on her job, keeping people alive. The base was a constant buzz of activity. Helicopters landed and took off at all hours, bringing in wounded soldiers or transporting teams to dangerous missions. Sarah had seen more blood and trauma in her 18 months deployment than most people see in a lifetime. She had steady hands and a calm voice that could comfort a dying soldier in his final moments. Her fellow medics respected her skills, but the combat soldiers barely knew her name. They called her Doc when they needed medical attention, but otherwise she was just part of the background machinery that kept the base running. Sarah didn't mind being overlooked. She had learned early in life that being underestimated could be an advantage. What the other soldiers didn't know was that Sarah had grown up hunting with her father in the hills of Texas. She could shoot a rifle before she could ride a bicycle properly. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had taught her that wars weren't won by the loudest voices or the biggest egos. They were won by people who could stay calm under pressure and do their jobs when everything was falling apart. The SEAL team had arrived 3 weeks ago, and they kept to themselves mostly. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, was exactly what Sarah expected from Special Forces. Tall, confident, and carrying himself like someone who had seen action in places that didn't exist on most maps. He had dark eyes that seemed to take in everything and a quiet authority that made even senior officers listen when he spoke. Sarah had treated 2 of his men for minor injuries during training exercises. Morrison had been polite but distant, thanking her professionally before moving on to more important matters. She was used to that reaction from combat soldiers. In their world, medics were necessary but not particularly interesting. The base had been receiving intelligence reports about increased enemy activity in the region. Everyone could feel the tension building like a storm approaching. Sarah had been working longer shifts, preparing medical supplies and checking equipment. She had learned to read the signs when something big was coming. During evening chow, she would sometimes catch glimpses of Morrison and his team planning their next operation. They spoke in low voices over maps and satellite photos, their faces serious as they discussed routes and contingencies. Sarah wondered what it was like to carry that kind of responsibility, knowing that your decisions could mean life or death for your team. One evening, as she was restocking her medical supplies, Morrison approached her station. He needed medical clearance for one of his men who had twisted his ankle during a training exercise. As Sarah examined the soldier's injury, she could feel Morrison watching her work. Her hands were steady as she checked for swelling and tested the range of motion. "Your man will be fine in 2 days," she told Morrison without looking up. "Keep ice on it tonight and have him take these anti-inflammatories. No jumping or running until I clear him." Morrison nodded, but instead of leaving immediately, he lingered for a moment. "You're thorough," he said simply. Sarah looked up at him, surprised by the comment. "Just doing my job, sir." "Good," he replied. And then he was gone, leaving Sarah wondering why such a simple exchange had felt different from all the others. That night, as she lay in her bunk listening to the distant sound of helicopters, Sarah had no idea that her quiet, invisible existence was about to change forever. Tomorrow would bring a mission that would test everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in this war. The enemy was planning something big, and soon Sarah Martinez would discover that sometimes being just a medic wasn't enough. Sometimes even the most invisible people had to step into the light and prove what they were really made of. The alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence like a sledgehammer through glass. Sarah bolted upright in her bunk, instantly awake as months of training kicked in. The base's emergency sirens wailed across the compound, and red lights flashed in the barracks hallway. She was pulling on her boots before her mind fully processed what was happening. "All medical personnel to the motor pool immediately," crackled the voice over the intercom. "This is not a drill. Repeat, all medical personnel to the motor pool." Sarah grabbed her medical bag and sprinted toward the designated assembly point. The base was in chaos. Soldiers running in all directions, vehicles starting up, and officers barking orders into radios. As she reached the motor pool, she saw Morrison and his SEAL team already geared up and loading into armored vehicles. Major Collins, the base medical officer, was briefing the assembled medics. His face was grim as he held up a tablet showing satellite imagery. "We have a village 12 kilometers north that's under heavy attack. Initial reports suggest at least 30 civilians wounded, possibly more. The enemy has the area surrounded, and our quick reaction force is pinned down trying to evacuate the villagers." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had been on evacuation missions before, but never into an active combat zone with enemy forces still present. Usually they waited until the area was secured before sending in medical teams. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," Collins continued. "We're sending 2 medical teams with the relief convoy. Martinez, Rodriguez, and Thompson. You're with Alpha Team. The rest of you will establish a casualty collection point here at the base." Sarah felt a cold rush of adrenaline. She was going into combat. Real combat, not just treating injuries after the fighting was over. As she checked her medical supplies one final time, she noticed Morrison approaching Major Collins. "Sir, I'd like to request that one of your medics be assigned to my team for this operation," Morrison said. "We're going in ahead of the main convoy to establish a perimeter and assess the situation. If we encounter casualties, we'll need immediate medical support." Collins nodded. "Martinez, you're reassigned to the SEAL team. Rodriguez and Thompson will go with the main convoy." Sarah looked up, surprised to hear her name called. Morrison was already walking toward his vehicle, and she had to jog to catch up. "Sir, are you sure you want me for this? I've never been embedded with special forces before." Morrison stopped and looked at her directly. "I watched you work yesterday. You stay calm under pressure and your hands don't shake. That's what I need right now." The ride to the village was tense and silent. Sarah sat in the back of the armored MRAP, surrounded by Morrison's team. The SEALs checked their weapons and equipment with practiced efficiency, their faces focused and serious. Sarah clutched her medical bag and tried to control her breathing. Through the thick windows, she could see the sun starting to rise over the Afghan landscape. The rocky terrain looked peaceful in the early morning light, but she knew that enemy fighters were hidden somewhere in those hills, waiting to attack anyone who tried to help the trapped villagers. Morrison's voice came through her headset. "Martinez, when we get there, I need you to stay close to me until we can assess the situation. Don't move to treat anyone unless I give you the all clear. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. As they approached the village, the sound of gunfire became audible even through the armored walls of their vehicle. Radio chatter filled their headsets, reports of casualties, enemy positions, and requests for air support. The quick reaction force that had arrived earlier was still engaged in heavy fighting on the village's eastern edge. Morrison studied the tactical display on his tablet, marking enemy positions and planning their approach. "We're going to insert on the western side and work our way toward the civilians. Intelligence suggests most of the wounded are in the village center, but we need to clear a path first." Sarah checked her medical supplies again. Bandages, tourniquets, morphine, IV fluids, everything she might need to keep someone alive long enough to get them to proper medical care. She had trained for this scenario dozens of times, but training never included the sound of real bullets or the knowledge that people were dying while she sat in the back of a truck. The vehicle lurched to a stop, and Morrison's team immediately went into action. "Remember, Martinez," Morrison said as he prepared to exit the vehicle, "stay with me, do your job, and trust your training. Today, you're not just a medic. You're part of this team." As the rear doors opened and the team prepared to move out, Sarah took a deep breath and followed Morrison into her first real combat situation. She had no idea that within the next few hours, she would be holding Morrison's most trusted weapon and making decisions that would save more lives than she ever thought possible. The first bullet cracked past Sarah's head before she even fully processed that they were under fire. Morrison's hand slammed into her shoulder, pushing her down behind a concrete wall as the rest of his team spread out into defensive positions. The peaceful morning had exploded into chaos in seconds. "Contact front 200 meters, Morrison called into his radio while returning fire with his rifle. "Multiple enemy positions in the buildings ahead. We need to move fast, those civilians can't wait." Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it over the gunfire. Through a gap in the concrete, she could see the village center about 100 meters away. Bodies lay scattered in the dirt courtyard, some moving weakly, others ominously still. These were the people she was here to save, but they might as well have been on the moon with all the enemy fire between her position and theirs. "Doc, you okay?" Morrison asked during a brief lull in the shooting. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, surprised that her voice sounded steady. Her training was taking over, pushing down the fear and focusing her mind on the mission. One of Morrison's men, Petty Officer Brooks, suddenly cried out and dropped behind his cover. "I'm hit!" "Right shoulder." Sarah didn't think, she moved. Crawling low, she reached Brooks's position as enemy bullets sparked off the rocks around them. His shoulder was bleeding heavily, but the wound wasn't immediately life-threatening. She pulled out a pressure bandage and began working while Morrison and the other SEALs provided covering fire. "How bad is it, Doc?" Brooks asked through gritted teeth. "You'll live," Sarah said, securing the bandage. "But you're not shooting anything with that arm today." Morrison appeared beside them during another lull in the fighting. "Brooks, can you move?" "Roger that, sir." "Doc fixed me up good." Morrison looked at Sarah with something that might have been approval, but there wasn't time to analyze it. "We need to reach those civilians, but we're outnumbered and outgunned. Air support is 20 minutes out, and those people don't have 20 minutes. Sarah peered around the corner toward the village center. She could see at least 6 people who were clearly wounded and needed immediate medical attention. One was a young girl who couldn't have been more than 12, lying motionless near a well. "Sir, I need to get to them. Some of those wounds won't wait for air support. It's too dangerous. We need to clear the enemy positions first." But as Morrison spoke, Sarah noticed something the others had missed. "Sir, look at the positioning of the enemy fire. They're concentrated on the eastern and northern sides of the village, where our quick reaction force is engaging them. The southern approach to the village center is relatively clear." Morrison studied the tactical situation for a moment. "You're right, but it's still exposed ground. Anyone crossing that space would be visible to multiple enemy positions. Not if they stayed low and moved during the firefights when the enemy is focused on your team," Sarah said. "I could make it across while you draw their attention." Morrison shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. You're a medic, not a combat soldier. With respect, sir, I'm the only one here who can keep those people alive, and I can handle myself." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "My father taught me to hunt in country a lot rougher than this." Another burst of enemy fire forced them all down again. When Sarah looked back toward the village center, she saw the young girl move slightly. She was still alive, but probably not for much longer without medical attention. Morrison was weighing their options when his radio crackled with an update from the Quick Reaction Force. "Alpha 6, this is Bravo 2. We're taking heavy casualties over here. The enemy has machine gun positions we can't dislodge. We need immediate support or we're going to have to fall back." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Morrison's team was too small to assault the enemy positions directly, and the main convoy with additional medical personnel was still 10 minutes out. Those civilians in the village center would be dead by then. Sarah made her decision. During the next exchange of gunfire, she started moving toward the southern edge of their position. Morrison grabbed her arm. "Where are you going?" "To do my job," she said simply. "Sir, I can save at least 4 of those people if I can reach them in the next 5 minutes. But I need cover fire." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw him make a calculation that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with the reality of the situation. Sometimes the right decision wasn't the safe decision. "Brooks, can you still operate a radio with that shoulder?" "Yes, sir." Morrison pulled his .50 caliber sniper rifle from his pack and checked the scope. "I'm going to that ridge position to provide overwatch. Brooks, coordinate with Bravo 2 for suppressive fire. When I give the signal, Martinez moves for the village center." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with gratitude. Morrison was risking his team's position to give her a chance to save those civilians. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet," Morrison replied grimly. "Just stay alive and do what you do best." Morrison's voice came through Sarah's headset as he reached the ridge position. "Doc, I have eyes on 3 enemy positions that could engage you during your movement. When I start shooting, you'll have maybe 90 seconds before they figure out what's happening and adjust their aim." Sarah crouched at the edge of their cover, medical bag secured tightly to her back. Her mouth was dry, but her hands were steady. She had run this route in her mind a dozen times during the last few minutes, a zigzag pattern that would use available cover while getting her to the wounded as quickly as possible. "Bravo 2, this is Alpha 6. Morrison radioed to the quick reaction force. On my mark, I need maximum suppressive fire on the eastern positions for 60 seconds. Roger that. Alpha 6. Standing by. Sarah could see the young girl more clearly now. She was definitely alive, but losing blood from what looked like shrapnel wounds to her legs. Next to her, an elderly man was conscious but holding his stomach in a way that suggested internal injuries. Further back, near a damaged building, 2 more figures lay motionless. Remember, Doc. Morrison's voice was calm in her ear. Low and fast. Don't stop for anything until you reach cover in the village center. I'll guide you from up here. Copy that, Sarah replied, adjusting her grip on her medical bag. Morrison's .50 caliber rifle cracked like thunder from the ridge. Almost simultaneously, the quick reaction force opened up with everything they had. The enemy positions erupted in a chaos of return fire, but it was directed away from Sarah's intended route. Go, 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 Morrison shouted. Sarah sprinted from cover, staying low as she crossed the open ground. Her father's hunting lessons kicked in, how to move quietly and quickly across broken terrain, how to use every bit of available cover. Behind her, Morrison's rifle continued its methodical work, each shot carefully placed to keep enemy heads down. Halfway across the open space, Sarah heard the distinctive whistle of a bullet passing close to her head. One of the enemy fighters had spotted her movement. Contact on the south wall. Morrison's voice was sharp with urgency. Adjusting fire. The .50 caliber rifle boomed again, and the shooting from the south wall stopped abruptly. Sarah reached the partial cover of a damaged wall and pressed herself against it, breathing hard but unhurt. Good work, Doc. You've got about 30 meters to the casualties. Wait for my signal. Sarah could see the wounded clearly now. The young girl was definitely the most critical, pale and clearly in shock from blood loss. The elderly man was conscious and trying to crawl toward better cover, which meant he probably didn't have life-threatening internal injuries. But there was something else that made Sarah's blood run cold. Sir, she radioed to Morrison, I can see at least 2 more casualties behind that building that weren't visible from our position, and one of them is wearing a U.S. uniform. Morrison's pause was brief but telling. Copy that. Probably someone from the original patrol that got caught when this started. Can you reach them? Not without crossing more open ground, and I can see enemy movement in those buildings. The tactical situation was getting worse by the minute. Morrison's team was pinned down. The quick reaction force was taking casualties, and now there were potentially American soldiers bleeding out in the village center, along with the civilians. Doc, I need you to focus on the casualties you can reach safely. We'll figure out the others when reinforcements arrive. But Sarah was already studying the terrain, between her position and the building where she had seen the figure in the U.S. uniform. There was a drainage ditch that ran most of the way there, but the last 20 meters would be completely exposed. She reached the young girl first, working quickly to stop the bleeding from her leg wounds. The girl was conscious but couldn't speak English. Sarah used her limited Arabic to reassure her while applying pressure bandages and starting an IV line. How is she? Morrison asked through the radio. She'll make it if we can get her out of here soon. Moving to the next casualty. The elderly man had taken shrapnel to his side, but the wounds were superficial. Sarah bandaged him quickly and gave him instructions in Arabic to stay low and wait for evacuation. But throughout her work, Sarah kept glancing toward the building where she had seen the American uniform. She could just make out a boot protruding from behind a pile of debris, and it hadn't moved in the past few minutes. Sir, I need to check on that American casualty. If he's one of ours, we can't leave him. Negative. Doc. Too dangerous, and you've got civilians who need continued care. Sarah understood the logic, but something in her training as a medic rebelled against leaving anyone behind. She finished treating the elderly man and moved to check on the 2 other civilians near the building. As she worked, she got a better view of the area behind the building. The figure in the American uniform was definitely a soldier, and from the way he was positioned, he was either unconscious or worse. But there was something else that made her heart race. She could see the muzzle flash of enemy weapons firing from a position that would give them a clear shot at Morrison's ridge position within the next few minutes. The enemy was moving, trying to flank Morrison's overwatch position. Sir, you need to move. Enemy movement on your left flank, about 200 meters. Morrison's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession. I see them. Good eyes, Doc. But Sarah realized that Morrison couldn't see all the enemy positions from his current location. There were at least 2 more groups moving through the buildings, and they were coordinating their attack. In a few minutes, Morrison's position would be surrounded. That's when she noticed something that would change everything. The American soldier behind the building was lying next to what looked like a damaged but possibly functional heavy machine gun position. "Sir," Sarah radioed, her voice tight with realization. "I think that American casualty is at a defensive position that could cover your withdrawal route. But I need to get to him to know for sure." Morrison's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Through her position near the building, Sarah could see what he couldn't from his ridge. At least 8 enemy fighters moving in coordinated groups to surround his overwatch position. They were using the buildings and terrain expertly, staying out of his line of sight while closing the trap. "Alpha 6, you have multiple contacts moving on your position," Sarah radioed urgently. "I count 8, possibly more, approaching from 3 directions." Morrison's .50 caliber boomed twice more. But Sarah could tell from the sound that he was now firing at targets much closer than before. "Roger that, Doc. I'm going to have to displace soon, but that means you'll lose overwatch protection." The tactical reality was stark. If Morrison had to abandon his position, Sarah would be alone in the village center with wounded civilians and no covering fire. The enemy would quickly realize there was an isolated medic in their midst, and her chances of survival would drop to nearly 0. But Sarah was also looking at the machine gun position behind the building where the American soldier lay motionless. If that weapon was functional, it could provide covering fire for Morrison's withdrawal and protect the civilians until reinforcements arrived. The problem was that reaching it required crossing 20 meters of open ground under potential enemy observation. "Sir, I'm going to check on that American casualty and the weapon position. If I can get that machine gun operational, it might give us both some breathing room." "Negative, Doc, too risky." But Sarah was already moving, using the drainage ditch she had identified earlier. As she crawled through the muddy channel, enemy bullets began impacting the ground around her previous position. They had spotted her movement. She reached the building and found Staff Sergeant Tommy Chen, a soldier from the original patrol that had been caught in the ambush. He was unconscious but breathing, with a head wound that looked serious but not immediately fatal. More importantly, he was lying next to a .50 caliber machine gun that appeared to be undamaged. "Sir, the weapon is functional, but I need to get Chen stabilized first," Sarah radioed while working to stop the bleeding from his head wound. Morrison's voice was tight with stress. "Doc, I've got enemy fighters within 50 meters of my position. Whatever you're going to do it fast." Sarah worked quickly to bandage Chen's head wound and check his other injuries. He had a concussion and some shrapnel wounds, but nothing immediately life-threatening. As she finished treating him, Chen's eyes fluttered open. "Where? What happened?" he mumbled. "You're okay, Sergeant. I'm Doc Martinez. Can you tell me about this weapon position?" Chen tried to sit up, then winced and lay back down. "Set up this position when the attack started. Was laying covering fire when something hit me. The gun's loaded and ready to go." Sarah looked at the massive .50 caliber machine gun. She had trained on similar weapons during basic training. But that was years ago and only for a few hours. This was a far cry from the hunting rifles her father had taught her to use. Morrison's rifle fire was becoming more frequent now, indicating that the enemy was closing in on his position. "Doc, I need to move in 30 seconds or I'm going to be overrun." Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. "Sir, I can operate this machine gun position." Chen's injuries aren't critical and this position has clear fields of fire on the routes you'll need for withdrawal. There was a pause on the radio. "Doc, are you qualified on crew-served weapons?" "Basic training only, sir, but it's like riding a bicycle, right?" Despite the desperate situation, Sarah could almost hear Morrison's grim smile through the radio. "Roger that. Chen, can you talk her through the weapon system?" Chen nodded weakly. "Standard 50 cal, Doc. Safety's here, charging handles here. Aim low, these things kick like a mule. You've got about 200 rounds in the belt." Sarah positioned herself behind the weapon and checked the sight picture. The machine gun commanded an excellent view of the approaches to Morrison's position, and the routes the enemy was using to maneuver through the village. "Alpha 6, I'm in position. Give me targets." Morrison's voice came through clearly. "Enemy squad moving through the buildings 200 meters to your left. They're trying to get behind my position." Sarah spotted the movement and lined up her shot. The machine gun was heavier than anything she had ever fired, but the fundamentals were the same as what her father had taught her. Steady position, Sight alignment, breath control, smooth trigger pull. The 50 caliber erupted with a sound like the world ending. The recoil was massive, but Sarah held on and walked her fire across the enemy position. The effect was immediate and devastating. The coordinated enemy advance stopped as fighters dove for cover. Good effect on target, Morrison radioed. Now I need covering fire for my movement. I'm displacing in 10 seconds. Sarah could see Morrison's route from the ridge to better cover, and she also saw the enemy fighters who were positioning themselves to intercept him. As Morrison began his movement, Sarah engaged every enemy position she could identify. The machine gun chattering in controlled bursts. Morrison bounded from cover to cover, his 50 caliber sniper rifle still in his hands but now useless as he focused on movement rather than precision shooting. Sarah kept the enemy heads down with sustained fire, amazed at how naturally the weapon handling came back to her. Alpha 6. You're clear to the rally point, Sarah reported as Morrison reached safety. Outstanding work, Doc, but we're not done yet. I'm coming to your position. As Morrison approached her building, Sarah realized something that made her stomach tighten. She had just engaged enemy fighters with a crew-served weapon, something far outside her role as a medic. More importantly, she had proven herself effective in a combat role that could change how Morrison and his team saw her capabilities. Morrison appeared at her position, breathing hard but uninjured. He looked at Sarah behind the machine gun, then at the enemy positions she had suppressed, then back at her with an expression she had never seen before. Doc, he said quietly, I need to ask you something and I need a straight answer. How comfortable are you with that weapon? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Comfortable enough to keep us alive until reinforcements arrive, sir. Morrison slumped against the wall next to Sarah's position, his sniper rifle across his knees. For the first time since the mission began, she could see exhaustion in his face. The constant stress of coordinating the defense while engaging enemy targets had taken its toll. Reinforcements are still 8 minutes out, he said, checking his watch. The enemy knows we're isolated here, and they're going to try to overrun our position before help arrives. Sarah maintained her position behind the machine gun, scanning for targets while keeping one eye on Chen, who was sitting up now but still groggy from his head injury. The brief lull in fighting had given her time to treat the remaining civilians, but it also meant the enemy was regrouping for another assault. Sir, I've been watching their movement patterns, Sarah said. They're coordinating through the buildings on the eastern side. If they mass for an attack, they'll probably come from 3 directions at once to split our fire. Morrison looked at her with renewed interest. Go on. The machine gun position can cover 2 of those approaches, but not the 3rd. If they're smart, they'll send their main assault up that blind spot while using the other routes for suppressive fire. Morrison studied the terrain for a moment, then nodded grimly. You're right. Which means one of us needs to be mobile to handle that 3rd approach. He hefted his sniper rifle. This isn't the right weapon for close quarters fighting. Sarah realized what he was considering and it made her heart race. Sir, you're not thinking of giving me your rifle. Actually, I am. Morrison's voice was matter-of-fact. You've proven you can handle the machine gun, but I need someone who can move and engage targets at different ranges. Chen's in no condition to fight and my team is still pinned down at the original position. Sarah shook her head. Sir, I'm a medic. I can operate the machine gun because it's a defensive position, but actively hunting enemy fighters is way outside my scope. Morrison's radio crackled with an update from his team. Alpha 6, we're seeing movement in the buildings. Looks like they're massing for another attack. Morrison made his decision quickly. Doc, I need you to take my 50 cal and move to that building over there. It'll give you overwatch on the approach I can't cover from here. I'll stay with the machine gun and Chen. Sir, I can't. You can and you will. Morrison interrupted, but his voice was calm, not commanding. Listen to me. I've been watching you for the past hour. You think tactically, you shoot straight, and you don't panic under pressure. Right now, you're the best option we have. Sarah stared at the massive sniper rifle Morrison was holding. Taking it would mean accepting a role she had never trained for, never wanted, and certainly never expected to have. But she also understood the tactical reality. If the enemy overran their position, everyone would die, including the civilians she was there to protect. Morrison held out the rifle. The scope is already zeroed for this range. Single-shot bolt action. Think of it as hunting, just with higher stakes. Sarah took the rifle, surprised by its weight and balance. It felt solid and well-maintained. the kind of precision instrument that her father would have appreciated. How many rounds? 10 in the magazine plus what's in the chamber. Make them count. As Sarah prepared to move to the overwatch position, Chen grabbed her arm weakly. Doc, that building's got good concealment but limited escape routes. If they spot you, you'll be trapped. Then I guess I better not get spotted, Sarah replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Morrison checked his watch again. 6 minutes until reinforcements. We just need to hold them off for 6 more minutes. Sarah made her way to the building Morrison had indicated, moving carefully to avoid detection. The structure was partially collapsed, but the upper floor provided an excellent view of the approaches Morrison couldn't cover from the machine gun position. Through the scope, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving through the buildings just as she had predicted. They were coordinating their attack, using hand signals to communicate while staying out of sight of Morrison's position. Alpha 6, I count 12 enemy fighters staging for assault. They're going to move in about 2 minutes. Roger that, Doc. Remember, you're not trying to win the war. Just keep them from overrunning us until help arrives. Sarah settled into a comfortable shooting position, the rifle steady against her shoulder. Through the powerful scope, she could see individual faces of the enemy fighters. They looked young, determined, and confident that they were about to overwhelm an isolated American position. They had no idea that a medic from Texas was about to prove them wrong. The first enemy fighter broke cover, sprinting toward Morrison's position, while others provided covering fire. Sarah tracked him through the scope, led him slightly to account for his movement, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the fighter dropped immediately. The others dove for cover, clearly confused about where the shot had come from. Good shot, Doc. They're reassessing now. But Sarah could see through the scope that the enemy was adapting quickly. They had identified her general position and were already moving to flank her building while continuing their assault on Morrison's position. The machine gun opened up with its distinctive chatter as Morrison engaged the main assault force. Sarah focused on the fighters trying to get around his field of fire, picking her shots carefully and making each one count. For the next 4 minutes, Sarah found herself in a deadly game of cat and mouse with enemy fighters who were becoming increasingly frustrated by the accurate fire coming from an unexpected direction. Every time they tried to mass for an assault, she would drop 1 or 2 of them, forcing them back into cover. Through it all, Morrison's calm voice provided updates and encouragement through her headset. Outstanding work, Doc. Reinforcements are 2 minutes out. But Sarah could see that the enemy was preparing one final desperate assault. They had taken casualties, but they still outnumbered the defenders, and they knew American reinforcements were coming. Sir, they're massing everything for one big push. I count at least 8 fighters moving to assault positions. Copy that. Doc, when this starts, don't worry about precision. Just keep shooting until they break or reinforcements arrive. Sarah chambered her last round and prepared for the longest 2 minutes of her life. The final enemy assault came like a wave breaking against a shoreline. 8 fighters emerged from cover simultaneously, some firing assault rifles while others threw grenades toward Morrison's position. Sarah had never experienced anything like the intensity of those final 2 minutes. Through the scope, time seemed to slow down. Sarah fired her last round, dropping an enemy fighter who was sprinting directly toward Morrison's building. The rifle was empty, but the assault wasn't over. She could hear the distinctive sound of Apache helicopters approaching, but they weren't close enough yet. Morrison's machine gun was chattering continuously now, sweeping back and forth across the assault routes. But Sarah could see that 2 enemy fighters had reached the building adjacent to his position and were preparing to throw grenades through the windows. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed a fallen enemy fighter's AK-47 rifle and fired through her building's window at the 2 fighters below. The weapon was unfamiliar and the shots weren't precise, but they were close enough to force the fighters to take cover instead of throwing their grenades. Doc, where did that fire come from? Morrison's voice was tight with concern. Still here, sir. Just had to improvise. The sound of helicopter rotors was getting louder now, and Sarah could see the first Apache cresting the ridgeline. The remaining enemy fighters must have heard it too, because their assault began to falter as they looked for escape routes. Morrison's machine gun fell silent as the last of the attacking fighters either retreated or lay motionless in the village center. The sudden quiet was almost as shocking as the previous chaos had been. Alpha 6, this is Reaper 2-1, came the voice of the Apache pilot over the radio. We have eyes on multiple enemy fighters withdrawing to the east. Request permission to engage. Reaper 2-1, permission granted. Doc, are you okay over there? Sarah slumped against the wall of her building, suddenly aware that her hands were shaking with adrenaline. I'm fine, sir. All civilians are stable for evacuation. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The main convoy arrived with additional medical personnel and security forces. Sarah found herself back in her familiar role as a medic, treating the wounded civilians and preparing them for transport to the base hospital. Chen was evacuated with a concussion, but would make a full recovery. The young girl with the leg wounds was stable and would be transferred to a civilian hospital in Kabul. The elderly man refused evacuation, insisting he needed to stay and help rebuild his village. As the evacuation was winding down, Morrison approached Sarah near the medical vehicles. She was cleaning Morrison's .50 caliber sniper rifle before returning it to him. Doc, I need to ask you something, Morrison said quietly. What you did today, that wasn't standard medic training. Sarah looked up at him, unsure how to respond. No, sir, it wasn't. You saved lives today, not just by treating the wounded, but by fighting when you had to fight. That's not something they teach in medical school. Sarah finished cleaning the rifle and handed it back to Morrison. My father always said that sometimes life puts you in situations where being good at one thing isn't enough. Today was one of those days. Morrison took the rifle and checked it over with practiced efficiency. Your father sounds like a wise man. He paused, looking at Sarah with the same expression she had noticed earlier. Doc, I'm writing a recommendation for your personnel file. What you did today goes way beyond the call of duty. Sir, I was just doing my job. Morrison smiled for the first time all day. No, Doc. Today you did a lot more than your job. Today you were exactly what we needed when we needed it. As the convoy prepared to return to base, Sarah found herself riding in the same vehicle with Morrison and his team. The atmosphere was different now. She wasn't just the medic who had been assigned to them. She was someone who had proven herself under the worst possible circumstances. Brooks, his arm in a sling from the wound Sarah had treated that morning, turned to her with a grin. Doc, next time we go out, you're definitely coming with us. But maybe we should get you some better weapons training first. Sarah laughed, surprised by how good it felt after the intensity of the day. I think I'll stick to medical training, thanks. Today was more excitement than I signed up for. But even as she said it, Sarah knew something had changed. She had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed and had been tested in ways that most people never experience. The quiet medic who had started the day, invisible and overlooked, had proven that sometimes the most unlikely people rise to meet extraordinary challenges. Morrison's radio crackled with a message from Base Command. Alpha 6, outstanding work today. All personnel are accounted for and the village has been secured. Well done. As Sarah watched the Afghan landscape pass by through the armored windows, she reflected on how much had changed in a single day. She was still a medic. That would always be her primary role and passion. But she was also something more now, something she hadn't been that morning. She was a soldier who had been tested in combat and hadn't been found wanting. Morrison's .50 caliber rifle had been in her hands for less than an hour, but it had been long enough to prove that when lives were on the line, Sarah Martinez could be trusted with any weapon, any mission, any responsibility. The convoy rolled through the gates of Forward Operating Base Chapman as the sun was setting. Tomorrow, Sarah would return to her regular duties as a medic. But she would never again be just a medic in the eyes of Morrison's team or her own estimation. Sometimes proving yourself happens in a moment. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. For Sarah Martinez, it had taken exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes of the most intense combat of her life.